So we're going to get into principles and aerodynamics of flight. So I'll say everything we do in the airplane is based off of aerodynamics, how the airplane flies, things like that. So it sets a really good foundation for everything. Sometimes, I guess everything we talk about in this class, sometimes people question, why do I need to know this? Why is this important? Hopefully at the end of the lesson, it makes a little bit more sense as to why it's important to understand aerodynamics. Even though you're not an aeronautical engineer, you're the person operating the aircraft, you still want to understand what's happening as far as aerodynamics. So basic introduction, structure of the atmosphere. You're going to see the slide come up probably 4 or 5 times throughout the course because we're going to relate everything back to it. So composition of the atmosphere. You guys don't necessarily need to memorize these numbers, just understand basically what the takeaway is, that our atmosphere is made up of 78% nitrogen, 21% oxygen, and these percentages or ratios don't change with altitude. So obviously air density decreases with altitude. Most people have experienced this when they're flying on an airline or they go driving in the mountains. They've experienced maybe shortness of breath or their ears feel like they need to pop. That's due to the pressure changes at high altitude. So you experience that in the aircraft as well. It's not that you are missing oxygen. The percentage of oxygen stays the same, but the pressure changes as you go up in altitude. So it's important to understand air is a fluid. So that's not saying that air is a liquid like water, but it's a fluid, meaning it can flow, it has some level of resistance, which we'll talk about, or friction. It could take the shape of whatever container it's put in. So that resistance or friction that we talked about is referred to as viscosity. So you may remember that from science class in school. So depending on how thick a fluid is, it has different levels of viscosity. So something like water would have low viscosity. It's kind of a thin liquid, it flows very freely. There's minimal resistance or friction to it. Now something, as we get into like oil or honey, the viscosity increases, it becomes thicker, and develops even more resistance. So air obviously doesn't have as much resistance as any of these fluids or liquids, but air still experiences resistance or friction. So that resistance we refer to as friction, like I mentioned, and the reason why it's important for us, because as you get close to the surface of the aircraft or the skin of that aircraft, it forms what's called a boundary layer, and you'll see that right here at the bottom right. So this black bar is the surface of an object, so whether that's the wing or just the skin of the plane. So the layer of air flowing over the surface that's nearest the surface of it experiences friction. And that's because no matter how smooth something may feel to the touch or to the naked eye, under a microscope, every surface is textured or rough. So even a brand new plane that has the best paint job, if you look at it under a microscope, it's going to be rough, kind of like this image right here. So as air passes over that surface, it experiences friction. And so the air passing over that surface tends to slow down, or it's actually going to be still. And that area is called a boundary layer. So the immediate layer above the surface of the object isn't moving at all, and that's called a boundary layer. And so that layer slows down the layer above that, which slows down the layer above that, and eventually you get far enough away from the surface where it's no longer restricted, or friction is kind of impeding the flow of that fluid. So this gets into something called drag, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And atmospheric pressure, like I said before, the composition of the atmosphere does not change with altitude, but the pressure changes. So you can see on this table right here, we're starting off at sea level, or 0 feet. And as you go up in altitude, up to 20,000 feet, this column is measuring pressure. So at sea level, pressure is measured as 29.92 inches of mercury. You don't necessarily need to memorize that at this point. We're going to refer back to these figures in a later lesson, these standard measurements. So at least in the US, we measure pressure in inches of mercury. Standard at sea level is 29.92. Really, I just want you to look at how the numbers decrease as you go up in altitude. So at 20,000 feet, it's more than half of that pressure. So it's 13.74 inches of mercury pressure. Pressure also decreases. So if at sea level we have 15 degrees Celsius, at 20,000 feet we have negative 24. So the takeaway from that is that as you go up in altitude, pressure decreases and pressure and temperature decrease. So we can measure these at what's called standard lapse rate. And so we can predict for every 1,000 feet, like it says right here, for every 1,000 feet, the temperature should decrease 2 degrees Celsius, and the pressure, should decrease 1 inch of mercury. So obviously these figures aren't perfect, but roughly for every 1,000 feet, this should decrease by 1 inch. And this column measuring temperature should decrease 2 degrees Celsius. All right, stay with me on this one. There's a few definitions coming up that are going to give you guys headaches today and probably at the very last class. Tends to confuse people a little bit. So we have different types of altitude in aviation depending on what is being measured. So we have one specifically called pressure altitude, and this is measuring our height or altitude above what's called standard datum plane. So there's that number again, 29.92. So that's the standard pressure at sea level. And so if you tune your altimeter, which is an instrument in the aircraft, if you tune it to 29.92, whatever that instrument tells you in altitude, that is your pressure altitude. So if you change that setting and that instrument tells you, hey, you're at 2,000 feet, that means the pressure altitude is 2,000 feet that day. There's a few other ways to measure it, and we'll talk about that in a later class. This is more so an introduction to pressure altitude. So that leads us to something called density altitude. So density altitude takes your pressure altitude and now applies non-standard temperature to that figure. So the reason why this one is important is because temperature affects air density. And so if we determine our pressure altitude and it happens to be a very warm day, that's going to increase our density altitude, which is going to affect how the airplane performs. So as density decreases, your performance is going to decrease. So there's going to be less air available for engine performance, less air available to produce lift. The flight controls are going to be less effective because the air is less dense to push against. So some things that affect air density, there's 3 principles. The first one is pressure, which can be understood as altitude. So as you go up in altitude, pressure decreases. Another way to think about it is as you go up in altitude, the pressure decreases, which means the air density decreases. So looking at this column right here, there's altitude on the left side of it. So at the surface, we have the weight of the entire atmosphere pushing down on you. And so the air is more dense. Air molecules are pushed closer together. As you get higher in altitude, they have the opportunity to expand and get further apart. The air becomes less dense. Easy way to think about this too is since air is a fluid like water, you can compare it to swimming. So if you're swimming on the surface of a pool or in the ocean, you don't feel much pressure on your body, especially if you put your head just under the surface, you don't feel much pressure. But if you dive to the bottom of a pool to maybe get something out of the water or just to see how long you can hold your breath, I'm sure everybody's experienced all that pressure you feel on your ears. It gets kind of painful. So the atmosphere works kind of the same way. So where we live on the surface is basically the bottom of the pool. And as you get higher up in the altitude, that's kind of the surface of the pool. There's less pressure. So just like the pool, the reason why you feel that pressure at the bottom is because you feel the weight of all the water above you now pushing down. Next is temperature. So temperature also affects air density. So as air heats up, these blue molecules start moving faster and faster, and they move further apart. And so you go from a density that looks something like this to density that looks like this. So warm temperature decreases air density. A conflicting idea is that if you're able to heat a container, something that's restricted, obviously pressure builds up. So something like a pressure cooker, you add heat to it, it creates more and more pressure inside of there. People think, oh, more pressure is more density. Without the restriction, air is able to expand and it becomes less dense. So it's not kept in a container. Next is humidity. So as humidity increases, water vapor displaces oxygen molecules and the air becomes less dense. So I think this is kind of a bad image. They all look the same. It's really hard to depict which one's water and which one's air. But really, water vapor is occupying the place that oxygen is, and it kind of pushes it out of the way. So just as a quick review, anytime altitude increases, heat increases, or humidity increases, air density goes down. So if you're flying in the mountains, high altitude, on a hot, humid day, your air density is going to be very low, meaning your aircraft performance is going to be pretty bad. Next, we'll talk about the four forces. So these are the forces that are acting on an aircraft. They're the forces that cause it to fly, to move forward, and all the resisting forces that oppose those. So the first one we'll talk about is lift, right here, this blue arrow, and that's number 3 here on the left. So that's the upward force that allow us to fly. Next is thrust, which is the forward acting force that kind of propels you forward, which is why they call it a propeller. The force that opposes that is drag, which is a rearward acting force that kind of holds the airplane back. Otherwise, we'd be able to go much faster. And then the force that opposes lift is weight. So an important takeaway is here at the bottom. So during straight, level, unaccelerated flight, opposing forces are equal or balanced. So if I'm flying level at 3,000 feet, I'm not climbing, descending, I'm just holding that same altitude, lift and weight are going to be equal, they're balanced. So if my plane weighs 2,500 pounds, that means I'm producing 2,500 pounds of lift in order to keep it suspended. Same with thrust and drag. If I'm maintaining my same airspeed, I'm not accelerating, I'm not slowing down, these two forces are going to be equal or balanced. Anytime I decide to climb or speed up, one of those forces is going to increase and it's going to overcome the other. Sometimes you'll hear all forces are equal. I like to be more specific in that opposing forces are equal. Because to me, it doesn't make sense that if I'm producing 2,500 pounds of lift, I also have 2,500 pounds of thrust. Doesn't make that much sense to me. So vectors, you'll see diagrams and things with these arrows on them. Those are referred to as vectors. It's just demonstrating directional force. because they have magnitude or strength as well as direction. So we don't always have just one single force being applied to an aircraft. You have combined forces. So lift and drag sometimes combine to produce a resultant force, like in this example here. So this is an airfoil, kind of a strange new word, but an airfoil is any surface that has an aerodynamic force when it interacts with the moving air. Most of the time when we talk about an airfoil, we refer to the wings, but really anything that has an aerodynamic force is an airfoil. So your flight controls are considered airfoils. Now some terms we'll look at. First one is just general terms. This is the front of the airfoil. So if we look at a plane, this is the front of the airfoil. This is the leading edge. So I guess it would be flipped from what you're saying. No, it'd be that way. So that's the leading edge. And then the back of the wing, or back of the airfoil, is called the trailing edge. So if you were to do a cross-section, like you see right here, and draw a straight line from the leading edge to the trailing edge, you get something called a chord line. So the chord line is this orange dashed line that runs from the leading edge to the trailing edge, and it makes a straight line. So if you were to take that chord line and extend it beyond the leading edge of the wing, and compare that to the airflow that's impacting the wing, which is called relative wind, it makes an angle. So the angle between the chord line and this relative wind creates something called angle of attack. So angle of attack is not the only method of producing lift, but it's going to be a strong, it's going to determine to a certain degree how much lift you're producing. So what that means is the more you pitch your airplane up, it's going to increase this angle between the chord line and the relative wind. So that means your angle of attack increases, angle of attack decreases. And it's not labeled, it should be, but this blue line right here is called relative wind, which is this word right here. So a second line, if you were to divide the top half and bottom half of your airfoil and draw an equidistant line, which is this black dashed line, that is your camber line. Because wings aren't perfectly flat, often designed with a curve. And that's measuring something called the camber line. So an important takeaway from this is your relative wind isn't always perfectly horizontal. Oftentimes people think that the relative wind is always going to be horizontal. Your relative wind is going to be parallel but opposite your flight path. So if I take the plane and fly it level like this, your relative wind is coming perpendicular but parallel to you, or sorry, opposite but parallel to you. If I were to descend, so now the airplane's going this direction, flight path determines that your relative wind is now coming at this direction. Same with a climb. So it's always going to be opposite your flight path. So that's why sometimes you can have a high angle of attack even though the airplane looks flat like this if the airplane's descending because the relative wind is coming from below. And so now if I were to kind of relate that back to this image, if my hand is the relative wind, now the airplane looks like that, which is a really steep angle of attack. The primary force we'll talk about is lift. We consider the key aerodynamic force. Obviously, it helps us fly, and so it's going to be generally the most important. There's a few principles that help us explain lift. The first one we'll talk about is Newton's third law, and then the second is Bernoulli's principle. So by themselves, neither of these principles explain lift completely. So you guys may have seen these laws of force and motion, again, going back to science class. The one we're primarily going to focus on is Newton's third law. So every force applied to an object is opposed by an equal force in the opposite direction, which easily translated for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. So how that relates to lift is that as the airflow goes around the wing, it doesn't continue straight back like this black line demonstrates. So the airflow follows the curve of the wing and experiences something called a downwash angle like this. So as air gets curved downward, the opposite reaction is to lift the aircraft in the opposite direction. This is an extreme example, but kind of like a rocket ship. You know, it blows out hot gas one direction and it propels the rocket one direction. So as the airflow gets bent this way, it has a lifting force pushing the aircraft upward. And again, that's only one part of the equation. So the other part is Bernoulli's principle, which is explaining as the wind interacts with the airfoil, it creates an area of low pressure as well as an area of relative high pressure. So since pressure wants to go from high to low, it has a lifting force that pushes the aircraft upward as well. So this combined with Bernoulli's principle helps the aircraft fly. So the way that Bernoulli, well, one way to explain this principle is using something called a Venturi tube. So as a fluid passes through this tube, right here the velocity and pressure are equal, and as it passes through a narrow throat or region, the velocity of that fluid increases, shown right there with that gauge, and the pressure decreases. So as a fluid is kind of restricted, it has to go faster, and as it goes faster, the pressure decreases. So how we control lift as a pilot, this is called the lift equation. You don't need to memorize this, just the takeaway, right? So what this is saying is that lift is equal to the coefficient of lift, which is referring to the angle of attack, times the area or the shape of the wing, 0.5 times air density times velocity squared. So if you kind of dissect that, it's just referring to this right here. So how can we control lift as a pilot? We can control it with angle of attack by changing the shape of your wing and with airspeed. So we change the shape of a wing with flight controls. We can add flaps, we can deflect ailerons or elevator. So anytime we change our flight controls, we're changing the shape of the wing or the airfoil. We can increase our angle of attack just by changing the pitch of the airplane, and we can change our velocity by speeding up, slowing down. So most people will understand this a little more organically. They don't necessarily memorize like, oh, I'm changing my angle of attack, therefore I need to change this. It usually happens naturally. People realize, oh, anytime I change my power, that affects this or it affects that. So a key takeaway from this as well is that anytime you change one component of this, you have to change a different part of the formula. So if I change my velocity by slowing down, I'm going to need to increase my lift some other way by increasing my angle of attack. If I increase my angle of attack, but I want to maintain altitude, I also need to slow down, or, it's a balancing act. Kind of the opposite example of that too is as you speed up, that means you need to decrease your coefficient of lift. Otherwise, you would continue climbing. And if you're trying to maintain altitude, but also increasing your velocity or airspeed, you decrease your angle of attack. So if you're flying along kind of at this angle and you add more power to speed up, the airplane would continue to climb. And so in order to keep this equation balanced, decrease your angle of attack if you're increasing your airspeed. Some of you may have heard of stalls. This isn't referring to an engine stall. This is referring to what's called an aerodynamic stall. So a stall occurs when you exceed something called the critical angle of attack. So looking at the bottom right here, this is a wing or an airfoil, and it's showing 10 degrees angle of attack. This one is showing 16 degrees angle of attack, and then this one is 17 degrees angle of attack. So there comes a point where the air is no longer able to flow smoothly over the top of the wing. It begins to separate or become turbulent. And when that happens, you have a rapid decrease of lift being produced. And so when that happens, you reach critical angle of attack. So what that's basically saying is you can't continue to pitch the airplane up and expect to produce lift. There comes a point where the airflow just separates from the wing, and there's a strong drop off in how much lift you're able to produce. So usually when that happens, there's a few indicators. Most aircraft have a stall warning horn, so you'll hear that horn start to go off. Other examples you would experience would be like a buffeting, meaning the airplane will start to vibrate a little bit. You'd feel a dropping sensation as the airplane descends. This doesn't mean that you stop producing lift altogether, otherwise you would just drop straight. It just stops producing enough lift to maintain your altitude, so the aircraft would start descending. This is something you will practice as a private pilot. It makes people a little bit nervous because they think they're going to fall out of the sky. And initially it kind of feels like that, but if you were to kind of step aside and look at the airplane, that's not what's happening at all. You're just losing some lift. So it gives some people anxiety. I think it's usually depending on how they're introduced to stalls. So some people have the mentality of, if this happens, you're going to crash, which is, in my opinion, kind of a scary thought for new students. It's a very normal maneuver. You want to avoid stalls close to the ground because there's not necessarily enough time to recover from it. But in that sense, it is dangerous. But throughout training, you're going to learn how to recognize them, how to prevent them, and how to recover from stalls. And you'll get very comfortable performing stalls. And you'll get comfortable with the steps on how to recover from them. So this is just a list of different stalls that you'll practice as a private pilot. You don't necessarily need to know those in order to pass the written test, but you'll practice those throughout your training. Next, we'll get into wing design. So wings are designed based off of the anticipated use of that aircraft. Does it need to be extremely fast and maneuverable, like this aircraft right here? Does it need to carry heavy loads over long distances? Something like that. Does it need to produce a lot of lift with minimal drag? Something like this. Does it need to go light speed, like something like this? So really, wing design is dependent on its intended use. They each have their trade-offs. Some, like this, are not going to glide very well. So if you lose engine power in something like a fighter jet, they're not going to be able to glide very well. They're going to descend pretty quick. Whereas something like this can glide very far. So a couple terms to look at: aspect ratio. That's referring to the ratio between the length and the width of the wing. So we're comparing the length of the wing to the width of the wing, front to back. So this one has a high aspect ratio, meaning it's a very long wing, but it's not very wide. So it's kind of long, skinny wings, something you'd see on like gliders. So it produces a lot of lift compared to how much drag it produces. Wing area, pretty straightforward. What's the surface area total of that wing? And then plan form is the basic shape, which is what you see right here. So if you were to look at an aircraft from either above or below, what's the general shape that that wing makes? That's referring to your plane form. And angle of incidence, you don't necessarily need to know this at the private level, but it's comparing the angle between the chord line and line parallel to the longitudinal axis of the plane. So if the plane was parked on the ground, what angle does that wing make with the longitudinal axis of the plane? So if this is the body of the plane and this is the angle of the wing, some planes are designed with a lower angle of incidence, other ones are designed with a higher. All right, next we get into weight. So compared to lift, this is pretty simple. The downward force is caused by gravity, always works towards the center of Earth. So no matter what maneuver you're doing in the plane, weight is always going to act towards Earth. So if this plane is moving like that, your weight is always going to be pulling you towards the center of Earth. So now thrust is a forward acting force. And if you look at the diagram to the left here, your propeller blade is an airfoil itself. So if you think about it as a spinning wing, it starts to make a little bit more sense about what's happening. So the propeller blade also has its own chord line, just like your wing. As it's spinning, it has its own relative wind, and that creates an angle of attack. And just like the principles we talked about before, you create an area of low pressure in front of the propeller, high pressure behind it. So that, along with the downwash angle of the prop, so if you were to stand behind a plane, you feel the air blowing you, just like if you were to stand in front of a fan. That, along with the pressure differences, are creating thrust. So it's kind of like horizontal lift, essentially. So it's pulling the airplane forward. Next is drag. So drag opposes your direction of flight. And there's a few different types of drag that we'll get into. The first one is called parasite drag. And let me know if I'm talking too fast or if I need to go back to a different slide or something. So parasite drag, that's pointing out this gray line right here, and we'll talk about what this is referring to. There's different categories of parasite drag. The first one is form drag, which is the general shape of an object as it goes through the air. So an airplane going through the air compared to something spherical like a ball are going to have different levels of drag just due to their shape. Next one is interference drag. So that's caused by disruption of airflow between different angles. So if you look at a plane, there's a lot of structural components to the plane. You have these struts right here that attach to the wing. You have landing gear. So each of these develop their own airflow. And when those angles interact with each other, they collide and they produce drag. So they often try to reduce this by reducing the angles between the structures, as well as adding fairings. So at these attachment points, you'll see plastic covers. Those are called fairings, and those are helped to reduce the angle. Because if they were to have like a really sharp 30 or 45 degree angle, it would produce a lot of drag. And skin friction drag. So this is what we started off talking about, is with the boundary layer and kind of the microscopic level of looking at the surface of the wing. So anything under microscope is going to be very rough textured. There's also lots of rivets, antennas, bolts, everything attached to the aircraft. So all of those are going to form skin friction drag. So those are types of parasite drag. Next is called induced drag. So a simple way to think about this is a byproduct of lift. So what that means is anytime we produce lift, a side effect of that or byproduct of that is producing drag. So just like when you breathe, a byproduct of respiration is carbon dioxide. So just from breathing, we're producing carbon dioxide. Just by producing lift in the aircraft, we're also increasing our induced drag. Easy way to think about that is, I have a better example. Cool. So if you look at this image right here of the aircraft, so if this blue line is your relative wind and it's showing your downwash angle created by the wing, your lift is being produced perpendicular to that wind. And so you're not always producing lift perfectly straight up or vertical. Your lift actually follows the path of that blue line. So now you see this blue arrow right here, and it's kind of acting backwards. And so that is attributing to your drag. It's working backwards. So if we were only producing lift where this gray arrow is, or even forward, that would not really indicate induced drag. So you can kind of think about induced drag as a rearward component of lift. So you're not always producing it straight up. Sometimes it's a little bit backwards. And so as you increase lift, you're also adding to that rearward component. And then total lift is just a combination of both of these and how they affect the aircraft. So looking at this table, it's comparing your airspeed to the amount of drag you're producing. So as you go faster, parasite drag increases, but induced drag decreases. And then the total drag formed is kind of on a curve like this. So really good problem to think about is, why do you think induced drag decreases with airspeed? Try not to make it sound like a riddle, but if you think back to the lift equation, remember it's kind of a balancing act between all of those components.
I know, but I'll let someone else answer it. Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, so why do you think that induced drag decreases with airspeed? And then I'll go back to here. So if we decrease velocity, or sorry, if we increase velocity, that means we can also decrease angle of attack. And so we're reducing that downwash angle. So it means we're just producing less induced drag.
Oh, okay. So less resistance.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah. So if you're going slow, the airplane is going to be flying kind of like this, higher angle of attack. As you speed up, it can go from here to flying a little bit flatter, lower angle of attack. So that means that your induced drag goes from this angle to now it's going to this angle. It's more vertical. So it's not acting as rearward.
Is it possible to have a completely vertical, like lift vector?
Yeah, you can have a forward lift vector. Or you could have a forward weight vector.
Or a forward wave, okay.
Yeah, which we'll talk about.
And does that, okay, yeah.
So that leads us to something called wingtip vortices, or vortex. So due to the pressure differential between the below the wing and above the wing, high pressure wants to go to areas of low pressure. And that's a very common thread that we'll talk about with weather, with aircraft performance. It's almost like inflating a balloon. So if you blow a balloon up and then let it go, you have higher pressure inside the balloon that wants to escape and come out to the environment. So you have high pressure below the wing and that wants to go to the area of low pressure. So as the aircraft flies forward, it forms a vortex like this direction, and it spirals and corkscrews behind the plane and sinks below it. So the reason why that's dangerous for us is because if we're flying in the vicinity of another aircraft, especially a large aircraft, that could be dangerous to us. We could experience really strong turbulence. It could even invert the plane if we fly through that. So it's kind of like flying through a whirlwind or like a tornado, essentially. So like it shows in this diagram, there's kind of a region at and below another aircraft that you want to avoid because this wingtip vortices sinks. It doesn't necessarily float and stay at the same altitude, and it doesn't rise. It will begin sinking. So you kind of want to avoid anything at the same altitude and below another aircraft. So we emphasize this pretty strongly here because, as I'm sure you noticed, we fly in the vicinity of large aircraft all the time. So it's particularly dangerous. So en route, you definitely want to avoid this region right here. And then even on the surface for takeoffs and landings, there are certain rules you want to abide by. So in this first aircraft here, if we're taking off, let's say a jet just departed, and now we're taking the runway to depart after them. In order to avoid their wake turbulence right here, sorry, I know it's probably kind of small from back there. You want to begin rotation and climb above their glide or their climb. So they're not producing wake turbulence while they're on the ground, not until they're producing lift. And so you want to rotate and climb above their flight path. Now for landing, so this aircraft is landing right here. They're producing wake turbulence all the way down to touchdown. And so if we are landing after a large aircraft, you want to stay above their flight path and touch down after they touch down. So I like the mixing bowl example. So in your cupboard, you have a large bowl and you put a smaller bowl on top of that to organize all your mixing bowls. So in this example, the large bowl is the jet. And now your flight path is a smaller bowl, meaning if you're landing after a jet, you want to stay above and touch down after them. And if you're taking off, you want to take off before and above their flight path. So it's kind of like putting a small bowl inside a big bowl. So avoiding wake turbulence, these kind of rules are going to come up on a written test. It's going to ask, when is wake turbulence most dangerous or strongest? It's when an aircraft is considered heavy, clean, and slow. So heavy, obviously a 737, 757 is going to be a heavy aircraft. Clean is referring to the configuration, meaning flaps and landing gear are up. And then slow. So it's going to be slowest when it's doing takeoffs and landings. So,
This is affected really specifically here in Orange County because of the noise abatement for bigger jets.
Yeah, I'd say one, our proximity to large aircraft, and another one is the steep climb gradient they have to do in order to avoid noise abatement. So there are certain rules to help us avoid that. We fly an offset departure and an offset final in order to avoid that. And even then, you can still experience it as you get close to touchdown or even after landing. Crosswinds can blow. So obviously we have parallel runways here. A crosswind can blow that wake turbulence over to our side. So you just want to keep an eye out. Generally, if I'm landing close to another, like if a jet is touching down just in front of me, even on the parallel runway, most of the time I just go around. Like I don't want to mess with that. I've had too many scares that I don't even bother. I'm going around. And it's kind of difficult to apply this rule of touching down after them on a small runway because by the time they touch down, that's half to 3/4 of our small runway. And so I can't touch down in that amount of time. So a lot of times it just makes sense to go around. If it's like a 737 for like Southwest or something, depends on the distance. If I see a Delta 757 coming into land or like a FedEx 757, I'm not even going to bother. I just go around. This question will come up on your written test. When is it most dangerous? Quartering tailwind. So quartering tailwind means that the wind is coming from behind you, kind of at an angle. Reason why it's dangerous is because it's going to blow the wingtip vortices across, and it's going to cause it to linger over the runway. So it's going to stay over the runway for a longer period of time, and it's just going to be sitting there mixing the air. So when you come into land, it's still there, and it's dangerous.
What causes the vortices to? So like I understand if there's a crosswind, that's how they can move, like left to right. But what causes them to sink? I mean, is there something about the spinning that makes the air more dense or something, so it falls, or like what? Why does it sink instead of just stay in place, just behind?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Could be due to the motion. Could also be air density. So it is higher pressure air.
When it's spinning.
Mhm.
When it's okay.
Well, in general, it's the reason why it's
Oh.
flowing is because it's higher pressure.
It's because, oh, I see. Okay.
So it could be because of that.
Huh?
So let's go and take a break, like 5-minute break. You guys need to stretch your legs, fresh air. We say.
Okay, I just want to make sure.
Is the stuff from Tuesday on the Google Classroom already?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll share that link with you.
Okay. I'm probably only going to be able to be here on Thursdays in general. I actually work with officer
Okay.
so I have to do currently, so I'm flying the first half of the week essentially. And then I'm doing the King's course online too, so I'll do it.
Oh yeah, that's fine.
Okay.
Yeah, if you have, we'll cover all the same things like King School does.
Yeah.
If there's like a particular question you have, just bring it in. We can talk about it.
Yeah, I'll probably review like the lectures that I'm going to send here as well as the content there anyway. So
Yeah.
I was just curious if that stuff was already on there.
Mhm.
Cool.
Yeah, and all the slides themselves I put on the classroom, and then like I said, I'm trying to record like the audio for it. So
Yeah.
if you are interested in listening in, you can.
For sure.
I wasn't paying attention, which is.
Um,
So there is a link to the slides? Or?
Yeah. So after class, I'll share that with you.
Oh, okay.
Uh-huh.
And should is there like any books I should just buy so I can read some extra stuff?
Yeah, I'll show you really quick. Actually, since we got a minute, I'll just share that with you guys now.
All the books like physical copies, and I'm like, well, wait, but they're all like, it's like what you said, like they're all online. He's like, no, I want you to have the fit. I'm like, okay,
Yeah.
okay, all right, okay, all right, fine. You're
Yeah.
the like assistant chief flight instructor, whatever. I'll listen to you.
Yeah, I prefer paper for most things because it's nice to study
Makes
and take
sense,
notes.
yeah.
But at the end of the day, even our syllabus says you can access things as PDF, which in my opinion is permission to do that, even from our own syllabus.
I mean, and I know I agree with him. It makes sense. Like with the book, I'm able to just flip. I can just flip to a specific page.
Mhm.
Whereas on a PDF, I like scroll. It's like it is a little bit harder that way. Yeah.
Yeah.
Control F, you can slide.
Or you can use
You
just
said-
like make.
You said you can use the PDF forms for the test, you said? Or did I mishear?
I was saying for our syllabus here, our flight training, it outlines required materials and it says most things can be accessed from the FAA as PDF, which one of our instructors demands everything be paper, but even our syllabus says you can access it as a PDF.
Okay, excuse me, I thought, gotcha.
So it was just conflicting opinions.
I'm confused actually because 2023 is when like I bought like last year's when I bought. Like, did that cut? Do you know? Did it come out like late 2023? Because like when I bought all my books, that was only like halfway through 2023. It wasn't like in. It was like
I don't know.
May. Okay.
Yeah, not sure.
Dang, so I probably just missed the dang.
So next we'll explain ground effect. So ground effect is a phenomenon that occurs when you're very close to a surface. So it doesn't necessarily say ground. The surface could be if you're landing on water, could be landing on a hard surface. But as you get near the surface, within about a wingspan of the surface, there's a disruption of airflow that occurs, which leads to a reduction in induced drag. So what that means is if this airplane is flying along, you can notice the angle between the vertical component of the lift here and this rearward component. As you get closer to the surface, due to the ground, that airflow is disrupted and you're no longer producing as much of that lift backwards. So just by getting close to the ground, you're reducing the amount of induced drag, which relatively is increasing your lift. So you're not producing more lift, you're just reducing the amount of drag, which by itself increases your performance. So for takeoffs and landings, you have a very noticeable increase in performance. This could cause the airplane to lift off before it's ready to. Really, it's more noticeable in like high density altitude situations. But if this airplane is taking off, ground effect would cause it to be able to lift off before it's ready. And once it leaves ground effect, it would cause it to sink back down to the surface. And for landing, if you have a little too much airspeed and you get within about a wingspan of the ground, the airplane's not going to want to settle on the ground. It's going to float for a very long time.
Would it be okay to think about ground effect as like because that downwash, like the angle of that downwash is changing and that air is it's basically bouncing off the ground, right? Or I guess because what I was going to say is it almost gives the aircraft sort of like a cushion of air. Is that a good way to think of it? Or
people have described it that way, and I would call that untrue. Untrue,
okay.
Yeah.
No, it don't. I actually think of that.
Yeah, so I wouldn't think of it as a cushion, like you're landing on a cushion and it's causing you to float. It's disruption of airflow.
And changing the perpendicular, like because it's perpendicular, right? So because the downwash is less vertical now, that's what lessens the rearward component. Okay.
Yep.
Okay.
So next we'll get into aircraft stability. So there's a few different definitions to get into and different types of stability. So stability refers to a design characteristic that makes an aircraft more easy to fly. So it reduces pilot fatigue, it makes it more, just repeating the word, more stable. It returns back to equilibrium in case of any sort of disruption. If you hit turbulence or some wind blows you sideways, it's going to return to being balanced. So just building off what I just said, stability, the actual definition, characteristic of an airplane in flight causes it to return to a condition of equilibrium or normal flight. Oftentimes these two get confused, maneuverability and controllability. So maneuverability is just how easily you can maneuver the airplane and it's going to withstand that stress. So something like a fighter jet is extremely maneuverable. So it can withstand the stress that you place on it. You've seen people, they're flying level and then all of a sudden they pitch completely vertical and fly upward. That increases this amount of stress on the aircraft and it's able to withstand it. And controllability, capability of an airplane to respond to your control inputs regarding attitude and flight path. So just because it's maneuverable doesn't necessarily mean it's controllable. So oftentimes advanced planes like that need some sort of assistance, otherwise it's not very controllable. Something like a Cessna isn't necessarily the most maneuverable, but it is very controllable. It's very stable. So different types of stability. You'll see here at the top, this first column on the left side is all referring to static stability, and the right side is referring to dynamic. So static stability is the initial response after being disturbed from equilibrium. So that could be an updraft, a sudden pitching, if the pilot pitches the airplane suddenly. Positive static stability is that the airplane naturally wants to return to equilibrium initially. So you can see right here, there's an updraft and then the plane returns to normal pitch. Neutral static stability is that it wants to continue in that disturbed state, so it's going to continue pitching up in the same path. And negative stability is that it pitches up and increases to get worse. So the instability increases. So you can think about this as putting a ball in a bowl. Eventually, the ball is going to level out and drop to the bottom, become balanced. And now if you flip that bowl upside down and put a ball on top of the bowl, it's going to roll off and get faster and faster in the direction you don't want it to go. The types of dynamic stability, it's really the same principle, but these are prolonged, or they occur over a longer period of time. So positive dynamic stability is initially there's a disruption and the plane has a few oscillations and returns back to equilibrium. Neutral dynamic stability is that it continues oscillating and it doesn't get worse, it doesn't get better, it continues in the same relative path. And then negative dynamic stability is that these oscillations actually get worse and worse and worse. Easiest comparison that most people have probably seen is when somebody gets speed wobbles on like a scooter or bike. You see that front wheel start to wiggle a little bit, and then it just gets worse and worse and worse. And then they go down and they end up on social media. So that same thing can happen in the aircraft is, you have an updraft or you adjust the controls, and if the oscillations get smaller and smaller and it goes back to level, then it has positive stability. If it has a disruption, maybe turbulence, and those oscillations get worse like this, that's going to be negative stability. So obviously you want positive stability.
And is it the shape of the wing that determines how much of a tendency it has for either positive or negative or neutral?
That's a great question. We'll talk about that right now.
Okay, perfect.
So before we get into the different types of stability and what affects it, we're going to talk about the 3 axes of flight. So I mentioned earlier the longitudinal axis, which is this yellow one right here going from the nose to the tail. So that controls roll. So if you were to imagine a pole going through the airplane from the nose to tail, and you were to rotate it along that axis, it's basically like grabbing the prop right here and spinning it that way. That's roll. And your ailerons control that. And next lesson we're going to talk about flight controls, so I'll save a little bit for then. So that's controlling roll. And the type of stability that this is referring to is lateral stability. So is it stable side to side? Next is going to be the green one right here is your lateral stability, which controls pitch. So now if you were to take a pole and go wing to wing and rotate the plane like that, that's controlling your pitch. And that's going to be controlled by your elevators. And that's referring to longitudinal stability. So it's referring to this direction. So the examples we just looked at are referring to longitudinal stability, this direction. Next is the blue line right here. That's vertical axis, and that's controlled with yaw, and that's directional stability. These get a little bit confusing because you have kind of the opposite names comparing the axes and the type of stability it is. So all of these axes pass through the center of gravity. So if you were to imagine a concentrated point in the aircraft, that's kind of the hypothetical point of where all the weight is concentrated in the plane. So anytime you roll the plane or pitch it, it's always going to rotate on that center of gravity. It doesn't rotate on the tail, it rotates right there. So all of those pass through the same point at 90-degree angles to each other.
So a plane's lateral stability is determined by the elevator trim? Then? Or wait, no, sorry. The lateral stability, yeah. The pitching motion.
Yeah, we'll get into that in a second.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So here's longitudinal axis again, the blue one going from nose to tail, controlled by your ailerons. which is controlled with the yoke, left to right motion. Just brief introduction because we're going to spend a lot of time talking about it next time, about controls and stuff. So now we'll talk about the stability. So on the longitudinal axis, you experience lateral stability. So stability left to right, like this. So a couple things dictate how stable it is on the longitudinal axis. First one to look at, weight distribution. So if you have one tank that is really full, one's empty, it's not going to be balanced side to side. And so if it is disturbed one direction, it's going to be very hard for the plane to go back to level flight. Something called dihedral, which is this top image right here. So most planes, their wings are designed as kind of a V shape. So sometimes it's really subtle, other ones it's pretty obvious. But the base of the wings is lower than the wing tips. So it makes kind of a V shape. Even the Cessna has this. So a dihedral, it's designed so that way if the plane is blown sideways like this, as it's kind of sliding sideways like that, because of the shape, I'll try not to break this anymore. So because of the bend, this lower wing creates a higher angle of attack than this one, and so that picks the low wing up. Same thing with a sweep back. So planes are angled like this with a sweep back. So that way, if it has a side slip like that, that face creates a higher angle of attack than this one, and it raises that wing back up. So, I mean, you could try it during flight training. If you were to just bank a Cessna and let go, that wing would pick back up and it would go back to being level. Lastly is a keel effect. So one component is the vertical stabilizer, also the side area of the fuselage. So this yellow part right here below the center of gravity, it kind of has a pendulum effect. So just like the keel of a boat, if it's going through the waves and gets kind of sideways a little bit, the mass below the center of gravity is going to cause it to become balanced again. All right, next is talking about the lateral axis, which is this yellow one right here. And what controls that is our elevator. So if you push forward or pull back on the yoke, that's going to deflect your elevators, and it's going to cause the plane to rotate on the lateral axis or pitch. So it's kind of a backwards way to think about it is usually when we are flying and we ask somebody, to climb or descend, we say pick the nose up or put the nose down. Really, that's just secondary. You're really controlling the tail. So I'm pushing the tail down up or I'm pushing the tail down, and it causes the nose to rise or to lower. Because what's controlling that is the elevator right here. So longitudinal stability or pitch. So this is the one that we were talking about with static and dynamic stability. So this is on the longitudinal stability on the lateral axis, so this way. So it's going to be dependent on these three things right here. So location of the wing relative to the center of gravity, location of the tail surface in relation to the center of gravity. So how far is the tail away from your center of gravity? So the further this is away from the center of gravity, it's going to be a little bit more stable. It's like going back to like a bike or a motorcycle, something with a really short wheelbase isn't going to be very stable. Something with a longer wheelbase is going to be more stable. So trying to ride like a BMX bike compared to like a beach cruiser or something, one has a longer wheelbase, it's going to be more stable. Area and size of the tail surface. So the larger the tail surface, the more stable it's going to be. So aerobatic aircraft usually have pretty large control surfaces, and that helps them become stable.
It's a matter of wing balance. It's not wing shock. Okay,
Yep.
I remember this now. Okay,
Mhm.
yeah. And that's why I meant longitudinal stability.
Yeah.
Wow, it gets confusing so easily.
So typically, your center of gravity will be, we'll go into this with weight and balance stuff, but just as an introduction, your center of gravity is going to be in front of your center of lift. So there's a concentrated point on your wing that's producing most of the lift. Your center of gravity is going to be in front of that. So now you have two forces. You have center of gravity pulling you down, center of lift pushing you up, and then the third force is your tail pushes down. So think about your tail as an upside down wing. It's pushing the tail down as you fly through the air. So you have airflow that's pushing this part up, this part down, and then the center of gravity is weighing you down. So the distance between your center of gravity and the wing are also going to help dictate how stable it is. If your center of gravity suddenly goes at the same point or behind your center of lift, the airplane's unstable. It's going to have negative stability. Vertical axis, this one's pretty simple. So this is going to be controlled with rudder input, which is this vertical surface right here on the tail. So those are controlled with your foot pedals. It's kind of a habit to break, as most people are used to driving with their feet, but now you can steer with your feet, especially on the ground. I don't know where that one went. So what's going to be controlling your directional stability is the tail surface, so the vertical tail right here. So if you're flying along and suddenly the airplane gets blown this way, the air is going to impact the tail, and it's going to keep the airplane straight or pointed in the direction of the wind. We're going to have a lesson dedicated to like weight and balance and stuff, but this is just reiterating what I told you about center of gravity, center of lift, and the tail down force. So center of gravity is going to be forward, and it's pushing down. Center of lift is pulling the airplane up, and your tail down force is balancing. So it's kind of like a seesaw. So you got the center point right here, and then the two seats on the outside of the seesaw. So going back to longitudinal stability, based off center of gravity, center pressure of the wing, and your tail down force. So if this is demonstrating your shifting center of gravity, that's going to have different effects on flight characteristics. So if you have a very forward center of gravity, I wish I could pause this. Nope, just goes forward. I'll talk really fast when it moves. So when that dot goes forward, that means your center of gravity is forward. That's going to be controlled with how you distribute weight inside the plane. So if you put two linebackers in the front seats and then you put two small kids in the back seat, you're obviously going to have a very forward center of gravity. Or if you have two really large people in the back, baggage, and then like one person in the front seat, you're going to have a very rearward center of gravity. So how you distribute that weight is going to affect some flight characteristics. So a very forward center of gravity, like it'll shift right here, causes the airplane to fly with the nose a little bit high, which seems counterintuitive. But as the center of gravity goes forward, naturally it wants the nose to drop like that. In order to fly in a balanced state, you need to apply more tail down force in order to counterbalance that nose, right? So you end up flying with a little bit nose high. So opposite happens if you shift that center of gravity backwards, is you need less tail down force, so the plane flies a little bit more level. So typically, commercial flights want to have a little more aft center of gravity because they're going to be more efficient. Lower angle of attack is going to be less drag. Less drag is going to be higher cruise speed, less fuel burn. Overall, saves money. Whereas a forward center of gravity is going to cause you to fly like this, which means more drag, lower cruise speed, and higher stall speed because you're closer to reaching critical angle of attack. On that note is that stall recovery is going to be better because the weight is far forward. So if this plane does stall, the nose will naturally want to drop. With an aft center of gravity, the plane's going to fly like this, so it's further from reaching critical angle of attack. So it's going to stall at a lower airspeed before it reaches critical angle of attack. But once it does stall, it's much harder to get the nose down to recover from a stall. Horizontal stabilizer. So that's what we're talking about, is produces the tail downforce, so it's kind of like an upside down wing. So at least in a high wing aircraft in a Cessna, air flows over the wing and impacts the tail, pushes it down. They just adjust that for something like a T-tail or a low wing aircraft, where they have to adjust the angle of incidence of the tail surface. So power effects. So anytime you adjust power, it's going to affect your performance, or not your performance, your flight characteristics and your stability. So decreasing power, at least with a high wing aircraft, is going to decrease the amount of airflow impacting the tail. So if I just reduce my power, so just by reducing power, the tail has less downforce, and it's going to pick up and it's going to pitch the airplane down. Adding power is going to increase the amount of airflow over the tail, and it's going to pitch the nose up. So you'll notice that as you're learning to fly, adjusting the power is going to affect your pitch. Also depends on the line of thrust. So typically in a light aircraft, your thrust line is above center of gravity. So if you imagine the red circle here is your center of gravity, if you add thrust, it's going to cause the plane to rotate downward like this. So that's to counter the tail force, and so it doesn't end up just pitching straight up by adding power.
Wait, say that again, because the center of gravity is below the, what's it called, the
Yep, so you see where
thrust?
see where the red dot is?
Yeah, like that cursor, your cursor. Right?
Yep,
You're just using
so
that.
where the cursor is, so your line of thrust is above that.
Okay. Yeah.
So you're rotating around this cursor.
Okay, yeah.
So it pitches down, but that just counters the pitch up effect of adding power.
It does the opposite too. The tail also acts as to pick the nose back up again, right? Or when you add power, then.
They're counterbalanced. So generally adding power is going to pitch the airplane up.
Right.
Because of the line of thrust compared to center of gravity, it's going to have a pitching down effect. All it does is just reduce how much it pitches up. It doesn't pitch it down.
Oh, okay, but it would be just less of a pitch up compared to an airplane with a higher center of gravity.
Yep.
Like a closer to the line of thrust. Okay.
Yep.
I see.
Yep. So if my fingers are the center of gravity, and then I apply a force above that,
yeah, it's gonna
cause it to do that. If your thrust line was below the center of gravity, like down here, it would rotate it upward.
Because that center of gravity acts like a hook almost, right? Like the force wants to act around, right? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
Got it.
Sorry, some of these got jumbled up. This should have been after stalls, but stall recognition and recovery. We covered everything except for recovery. So you want to think about what caused the stall to occur, and that's exceeding critical angle of attack. So high angle of attack compared to your relative wind. So in order to recover, you just need to reduce that angle somehow. So typically, stall recovery goes back to reducing your angle of attack, applying full power, and then adjusting your power as necessary from there. Spins and different phases of spin. So a spin is going to be caused by, first, a stall. Both wings need to be stalled for a spin to occur. That will be a written test question for you, is when does a spin occur? Options will say, oh, when the left wing is stalled, the right wing is stalled. Both wings need to be stalled in order to spin. But typically what happens is the aircraft needs to be uncoordinated or yawing in one direction. And so if you stall while the aircraft is yawed, it's going to drop to that side. And as it falls to one side, the outer wing goes faster than this wing, and it regains a little bit of lift, and that causes it to corkscrew. So that could lead to what's called an erect spin, which is kind of what I just showed you, where the nose is facing the ground like this. You could have inverted spin. So unless you're doing aerobatics, you probably, or you're Denzel Washington, you probably won't get to, you probably won't reach an inverted spin. A flat spin. So a flat spin is usually going to happen when you have an aft center of gravity. And so now the plane is going to rotate along that center of gravity. And this is going to be harder to recover for because you don't have enough force to get the nose down. So different phases, you have the incipient spin, which is going to be the first few seconds. It's about 2 turns, fully developed spin, and then recovery phase. So acronym to recover from a spin is PARE, P-A-R-E. So if you enter a spin, your first thing you want to do is reduce power. So power to idle. Otherwise, you're just going to be spinning faster. People often compare this to a stall because it is caused by a stall, which during a stall you generally add power. But during a spin is you want to slow the rotation down, so you reduce your power. Then you go ailerons neutral. Most people's knee-jerk reaction is just like driving on ice, is that once they start spinning on ice is that they want to yank the wheel the opposite direction. You want to keep your ailerons neutral because what happens is if the airplane is spinning to the right, like this example, if I turn the ailerons to the left, what that does is it's going to deflect, or sorry, it's going to raise this aileron up and deflect this one down. So if you deflect this aileron down, it increases the angle of attack of this low wing, and it actually just aggravates the spin more because you're changing the shape of the wing. So keep your yoke neutral, centered. Rudder opposite. So your wing is stalled, your tail surface, your rudder is not stalled. So to stop the spin, opposite rudder. So if you're spinning to the right, use left rudder, and that'll help stop the spin. The airplane's still going to be stalled and descending, but now it's not spinning. And so now you can push the elevator forward, which is kind of alarming because you're already spinning like this. That just means that your relative wind is coming from this direction. So going back to this, that's a very high angle of attack. So you need to decrease your angle of attack more by pitching down, regain lift, and then bring it out of the descent. You will not practice this as a private pilot, so don't worry. Hopefully you don't practice this as a private pilot, have to practice it as a private pilot. It used to be required years ago. I think the reason why they stopped doing it is because it led to more accidents than it prevented. So, yeah, just prevent it. If you want to fly commercially, you're going to have to do this as a CFI. You might even do it as a commercial pilot, just for during your training. Yeah, during private pilot, you just learn to prevent it, as well as recover from stalls.
Yeah, it's stall recovery, spin prevention.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Sorry, just a few more and we'll wrap up. We have something called left turning tendencies, and they're caused by a few different principles. First one right here is called torque. So you have a very strong rotational force due to the engine and propeller. So relating that back to Newton's third law, equal and opposite reaction is for the aircraft to rotate the opposite direction. So if your engine is spinning clockwise from your pilot seat, the airplane is going to want to rotate this way. Next is P factor. So your propeller has an angle of attack, like we talked about before. As it's rotating in a clockwise direction, particularly at a climb, the descending side of the blade creates a higher angle of attack and produces more thrust than the ascending side, or side going up. So as this side goes down, it takes a bigger bite of air, produces more thrust, and causes the plane to yaw to the left. So easy way to compare it is like you're paddling a rowboat. You got 2 paddles. You put one of those paddles flat in the water and the other one is actually helping you row. That's kind of what your propeller blades are doing, not to that same degree. But as you're climbing, one of those blades creates a bigger scoop. and so it's causing you to yaw to the left. It's not scary, it's not uncontrollable, it's noticeable, and you have to use right rudder to counter that left turning tendency. Next is spiraling slipstream. So you have a giant fan in front of your airplane that's creating a spiral or corkscrew of wind around the plane. It eventually reaches and impacts the vertical tail surface right here and pushes it that way, causing you to yaw to the left. Next is gyroscopic precession, and this is going to be primarily in tailwheel planes. So a gyroscope, when a force is applied to a spinning gyro, that force occurs 90 degrees ahead of where that force was applied. So in a tailwheel airplane, as the plane is rolling down the runway for takeoff, they first lift the tail off the ground, and then they're going to be on these two front wheels, and then they lift off. So the motion of lifting the tail off the ground applies a force to the spinning propeller here. Since it's rotating, that force is applied 90 degrees ahead, so it causes it to yaw that way. You will not be flying a tail wheel here, but you still need to be familiar with all four of these principles. So these are going to be strongest with a low airspeed, high power setting, and high angle of attack. So takeoff. During takeoff, you're essentially going slow, but you're climbing at a steep angle, so you have a high angle of attack, and you have full power, so there's your high power setting. All right, so next we're going to aerodynamics of climbing and descending flight. So this is kind of overcomplicating it, but imagine if you just pitch your airplane up. Since your weight always acts rearward, no matter how you pitch the airplane, if weight is the blue pen, it's acting backwards. So now your weight is contributing to drag. And so since you're contributing to drag, you need to overcome that by adding more power. Otherwise, you'll continue to slow down. It's like you're riding a bike uphill. After a few feet, you start to lose steam. You have to start pedaling harder and harder and harder, just like climbing in an airplane is. Initially, you pitch up, you'll start climbing nice, and then your airspeed will start to slow down because now you have more drag. So you gotta add more power to overcome that. So descending, same thing happens, is as you pitch forward to descend, your weight is acting forward, so it's contributing to your thrust. So unless you wanna go really, really fast, you have to reduce your power when you descend, otherwise your airspeed is gonna continue to go up. Got a couple more, promise. This chart is comparing your lift to drag ratio. So we looked at drag previously. This table is comparing angle of attack and coefficient of lift, coefficient of drag and lift to drag ratio. So this green line right here is showing lift to drag. And right here at 6 degrees angle of attack, you're producing your lift to drag max. So that's the most amount of lift compared to the amount of drag you're producing. So that's kind of where you want to be. That's generally going to be called your best glide speed. So you get the most performance compared to how much drag you're producing. And then turning in flight. So when you bank the airplane, your lift is no longer perfectly vertical. You're producing lift horizontally, which is called horizontal component of lift. And some of that is vertical. That results in this total lift vector right here, this blue arrow, that's pulling you towards the inside of a turn. So if you ever played tetherball as a kid, this is your tether. So that total lift vector is working towards the inside of a turn, and it's causing the airplane to turn as you bank it. You have some other forces too. Obviously, weight is always acting towards center of Earth. A centrifugal force, so that's the force you feel when you turn your car and you feel yourself kind of like hit the door. Or if you put something on the dash and you turn really sharp, it's going to go sliding. That's centrifugal force. So as you bank the plane, these two forces combined have a resultant load right here, or load factor. And then we have adverse yaw right here. So anytime you bank the airplane, you deflect the rising wing, so this aileron is deflected downward. This aileron is deflected upward. So you're producing more lift on this wing, which causes it to rise up and bank the airplane. So from what we talked about before, anytime you produce more lift, you also produce more drag. So since you're producing more drag on this rising wing, that increases your drag and it causes the airplane to yaw to the left. So that's called adverse yaw. So the way we counter that is by adding rudder. So if this plane were turning to the right, just like that one, the tail or the wing would actually be pulled backwards like this, causing the plane to turn like that. So you just apply rudder in the direction of your turn to keep the nose and the tail in the same direction. So that's primarily what rudder is used for. We don't fly with rudder, but it's used to stay coordinated. This is just comparing rate and radius of turn. So at a constant airspeed, like it says right there, the more you bank, it's going to decrease the radius of your turn. So a 30-degree bank is going to have a really small radius of turn, whereas a 10-degree bank angle is going to have a large radius. Now, if you hold the angle of bank at a constant angle, but you increase your airspeed, that's going to cause your radius to increase as well. Again, going back to a driving comparison, the faster you're going, the larger U-turn you have to make. So if I'm going 5 miles an hour, I could do a pretty small U-turn. If I'm going 20, 30 miles an hour, it's going to be a pretty big turn. So same thing applies to aircraft. The faster you go, the larger your turn is going to be. Load factor and stall speed. So load factor, like we looked at before with that force vector, is as you bank the airplane, you're increasing your load factor, or how much weight the airplane feels. So load factor is measured as G-force, essentially. So with 0 degrees of bank, you and the plane are feeling 1 times the force of gravity. And then if you compare it to 60 degrees of bank, you're feeling 2 times the weight that you normally would. So the aircraft and yourself feel twice as heavy as they normally would. And this is just a table version of that same principle. So 60 degrees of bank, compare that to the left here, you're feeling 2 times the force of gravity. So questions will come up on this about how much does an airplane weigh at 60 degrees of bank, and you're just multiplying this load factor times the weight provided on the example. I only mention this because there will be a question at the end of this class that may come up. And velocity G load, so this is called a VG diagram, and this is comparing your airspeed and load factor to structural limitations of the aircraft. So operating in the green range at 1G, which is this blue arrow right here, the airplane is within a safe region. As it exceeds maximum structural cruising speed, it gets into this caution range right here. If you were to go beyond that and exceed VNE, never exceed speed, you reach this red region right here, which you could have structural failure. So we have speed limitations in the aircraft, which are indicated with red on the airspeed indicator. You can also exceed that by increasing your load factor. So if you're flying this fast and suddenly increase your load factor by banking very strongly or enter turbulence, that's going to bring the airplane from the green up to the orange or to the red. So we have something called maneuvering speed, which is indicated right here. So it's a speed that's indicated in the POH that tells you if you enter turbulence, as long as you're at or below this airspeed, it's going to bring you into this kind of beige area right here, which is an accelerated stall. And so that just means you're going to stall the airplane before you break it or before you reach structural limitation. It's also the airspeed, which you can use full abrupt control movement in one direction without breaking the plane. There's been instances where somebody experiences turbulence or an emergency situation, and they use multiple control movements, and that causes the flight controls to break. And in that case, you lose control of the aircraft. So as long as you're at or below this airspeed and you're able to use one full deflection of flight control one time without overstressing the aircraft. Yeah, I recommend going over this one at a later time. It's just comparing all of these plot points and what those refer to in the aircraft as far as V speeds. So stalling speed, maneuvering speed, never exceed speed, maximum structural cruising speed, all those. So I recommend reviewing those because something like this could come up on the written test. It says, what does the line from A to J mean? And in that case, you have to look at this and remember back to what that means.